The city doesn't care about Zoe. It never has. At 4 a.m., Seoul is all wet pavements and cold silence, and Zoe is exactly where she always is, invisible, pushing her cart through an empty alleyway, earbuds in, doing the work the city needs done but never thinks about. She's 3 blocks from finishing her shift when the headlights hit her. 3 black SUVs, moving fast, stopping hard. The doors open before the engines die. Men in suits, 4, 5, 6 of them, step out and form a half circle around her, like walls deciding to close in. No badges, no uniforms, no explanation, just presence. The kind of presence that means this is not a request. One of them steps forward. His English is clipped, precise, final. You, come with us. Zoe pulls out one earbud. She looks at the SUVs, looks at the men, looks down at her broom. She has 3 more blocks. She doesn't run, she doesn't shake. She stands there with the kind of bone-deep, undefeatable calm that only comes from a woman who has already survived the worst life had to offer. And that stillness, that refusal to shrink, is the first and most important thing that makes Zoe dangerous. They take her anyway. She's brought through a private elevator, up 47 floors, and walked into a penthouse where the lights are low and the silence costs money. A man is sitting in the dark like he was built for it, still, controlled. The kind of still that isn't peace, it's precision. Kang Jin-ho. Even Zoe, who doesn't know Seoul's underworld, feels it the moment she's in the same room as him. Something old and cold and completely certain of itself. He doesn't look at her when she enters. He takes his time. And when he finally turns, when those eyes find her across the room, his voice comes out quiet, the way a room goes quiet just before something breaks. I need a wife. You need money. We don't have to like each other. Zoe holds his gaze, doesn't flinch, doesn't fold. How much? She thinks she's making a survival decision. She thinks this is just another version of the hard choices she's always had to make. Take the difficult thing, endure it, come out the other side. She has no idea that the man sitting across from her has spent 15 years building an empire from the inside out, legal wealth dressed in criminal clothing, aimed like a loaded gun at the people who destroyed everything they loved. She has no idea that director Yoon, the most dangerous man in Seoul, is already watching. And she has absolutely no idea that within weeks, she will become the one thing this ruthless, calculated, untouchable man cannot afford to lose. But we do. If you're already in, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Right now, tell us where in the world you're watching from. This story is just getting started. The penthouse was nothing like anything Zoe had ever stood inside. It wasn't just the size, though it was enormous, all cream lines and floor-to-ceiling glass, the entire city of Seoul glittering 47 floors below like it was performing for whoever lived here. It was the silence, the particular, expensive silence of a place where nothing happened by accident. A woman was waiting for her on the other side of the room, late 30s, sharp posture, sharper eyes. She introduced herself as Mira, Jin-ho's head of operations, though she said it the way people say things they don't feel the need to explain. The terms were laid out without ceremony. Zoe would live in the penthouse. She would attend events, dinners, and public appearances as Jin-ho's wife. She would learn the rehearsed details of their fictional relationship, how they met, how long they'd been together, what she called him in private. She would not ask questions about his business. She would not contact anyone outside without clearing it first. She would not, under any circumstances, deviate from the agreed performance. In return, she would receive more money than she had made in the last 4 years combined, with a significant portion transferred to her immediately, enough to cover 6 months of her mother's treatment back home. Zoe sat with the contract in her hands for 43 seconds. She counted. Then she signed. Smart, Mira said. and it didn't sound like a compliment. They showed her to a room that was larger than her entire apartment. A wardrobe had been prepared, dresses, heels, everything selected in her size, with the kind of precision that reminded her she had been chosen deliberately, not randomly. She left the wardrobe untouched and placed her own worn bag at the chair by the window, took out her mother's photograph, set it on the counter. It was a small thing. It was the only thing that was hers. She was standing at the window watching the city below when she heard him. Jin-ho had appeared in the doorway without a sound. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He wasn't looking at her bag or the photograph. He was looking at her. The way someone looks when they're recalculating something. "The wardrobe is for the role," Jin-ho said. "I know what it's for," Zoe replied, without turning around. A pause, long enough to mean something. "Get some sleep. There's an event Friday." He left as quietly as he'd arrived. Zoe turned back to the window. Below, Seoul moved and breathed and carried on, enormous, indifferent, completely unbothered by the fact that her entire life had just changed in the space of an hour. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. "Survive," she told herself. "That's all. Just survive this." She didn't know yet that surviving Jin-ho's world would turn out to be the easy part. The first week was a performance with no audience. They rehearsed their story in a conference room on the 32nd floor, the same floor where Mira ran Jin-ho's legitimate operations with the kind of disciplined efficiency Zoe had only ever seen in hospitals and military films. They sat across a table and went through dates, details, the architecture of a relationship that had never happened. Jin-ho answered every question with flat precision. Zoe matched him. Neither of them flinched. In public, it was seamless. Jin-ho knew exactly how to occupy space in a way that made a room rearrange itself around him, and Zoe, who had spent years being invisible, discovered, to her own surprise, that she knew how to stand inside that space without disappearing. She held his arm at the right moments, laughed at the right times, deflected probing questions with the particular warmth of a woman who seemed open and gave nothing away. Mira watched from a distance and said nothing, which, Zoe had already learned, was the closest thing to approval Mira offered. Behind closed doors, it was a different world. They occupied the penthouse like two people who had silently agreed on a set of invisible borders. Jin-ho was gone before she woke and returned after midnight. When their paths crossed, over coffee, in the hallway, at the kitchen counter at odd hours, the silence between them was functional, professional, neither hostile nor warm. Zoe filled the space the way she always had, with small, stubborn acts of herself. Her key in the morning, her music low through one earbud while she read, her mother's photograph holding its ground on the kitchen counter despite the fact that nothing else in the penthouse was personal. It was the music that started it. 2:17 in the morning, and Zoe was sitting on the kitchen counter eating leftover rice when Jin-ho walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and then, because the silence had nowhere useful to go, Zoe said, "There's more if you want it." He almost didn't sit down. She could see the calculation in him, the brief internal audit of whether this was a border crossing. Then he pulled out the stool across from her and sat. They talked for 40 minutes. It started as friction. Zoe asked a question he didn't want to answer and told him his non-answer was an answer, which made something flicker dangerously in his expression. Then somehow the friction caught, shifted, and became something else. He said something dry and unexpected, and she laughed, genuinely, suddenly, and he watched her laugh with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she went to bed, she lay in the dark staring at the ceiling. "Don't," she told herself. "Don't make anything out of that." Across the penthouse, in his own room, Jinho stood at the window for a long time before he slept. The event was held in a building that costs more than most countries' annual budgets, all marble floors and architectural light, and the specific kind of quiet that money uses to announce itself. Zoe wore a deep green dress she'd chosen herself from the wardrobe, ignored the heels they'd selected, and found a pair she could actually move in. Mira had looked at her shoes and started to say something. Zoe had looked at Mira. Mira had said nothing. On Jinho's arm, moving through that room, Zoe understood for the first time the full weight of the world she had signed a contract to enter. These were not simply wealthy people. These were people for whom wealth was the least interesting thing about them. She could feel the power transactions happening in real time, in held eye contact, in the particular way men angled their bodies toward Jinho when he spoke, in the careful calibration of every smile in the room. She kept her own smile easy and her eyes moving. It was during the second hour that Director Yoon found her. He was not what she expected. She had imagined, without quite forming the thought, that the kind of man Jinho watched with cold eyes would look dangerous. Yoon looked like a university professor, silver at the temples, a warm handshake, the kind of face that made television audiences trust him. He had been a public figure for years, policy work, civic foundations, the respectable face of institutional Seoul. He shook her hand and said something gracious about how long he'd waited to meet her. Then, without changing his expression at all, he began to probe. It was surgical, questions folded inside compliments, observations carrying the weight of implications. How long had she been in Seoul? Did she find it isolating being so far from home? Jinho was such a private man. It must be quite an adjustment being welcomed into his world. Zoe smiled and answered every question with the warmth of a woman who had nothing to hide and the precision of a woman who understood exactly what was happening. When Yoon excused himself, she kept her posture easy until he was out of sight. Later, in the car, she told Jinho exactly what had been said, every word, every sequence, the particular pause before the last question. Jinho was quiet for a long moment. "You remembered all of it," he said. "I remember everything," Zoe replied. "What is he to you?" Jinho looked out the window at the city passing in the dark. He said, "Old business." It was the first time Zoe understood that his cold wasn't emptiness, it was compression, something dense and old and pressurized being held in a very controlled space. She didn't push, but she held on to the thread. It started with small things, the kind of things you only notice if you're already watching. Jinho rerouted her morning commute on a Tuesday without explanation. She discovered it because her driver took a different road, and when she asked why, the man went very still for exactly 1 second before saying there was construction on her usual route. There wasn't. She checked. At a dinner 3 days later, a man across the table spoke over her twice in the same minute. Jinho didn't raise his voice. He simply shifted the conversation with the quiet, final authority of someone who didn't need volume to move things, and the man didn't speak over her again. A week after that, she noticed that the security on the floor below was rotating on a pattern she recognized from somewhere. It took her 2 days to place it. Military. The rotation was military. She started watching his men more carefully. They were disciplined in a way that didn't fit. Career criminals developed a specific kind of loose confidence, the walk, the posture, the eyes. Jinho's people were precise, controlled. They communicated in short, complete sentences, and they listened when they were spoken to. One of the senior men, a quiet giant named Taewon, had a scar along his jawline that Zoe, who had grown up around enough trouble to know the difference, was fairly certain came from something other than street violence. And then there was the business itself. Zoe was not naive. She knew what she had signed a contract with. She was not looking for Jinho to be something he wasn't. But the longer she moved through the edges of his operation, overhearing fragments, watching transactions, noting what Mira managed and how, the more a specific absence became impossible to ignore. There were no victims on his side. Not the kind you'd expect. No trail of addiction, no debt collectors breaking up families, no bodies that pointed back to him in the way that the truly destructive criminal operations always left a trail. His power was enormous, and his reputation was terrifying, and yet the damage always seemed to flow in one direction, upward, at people who already had too much. She brought none of this to him directly, not yet, but one evening she found him in the kitchen, a rare, unguarded moment, tie loosened, standing at the counter reading something on his phone, and she said, casually, without looking up from her own book, "Your men don't move like criminals." The silence that followed had a different texture than his usual ones. "Go to sleep, Zoe," he said, but his voice, just barely, had shifted, like something behind a door that had moved without opening. She turned a page and said nothing more. The picture was not complete, but it was building, and Zoe had always been very, very good at waiting until she had enough pieces before she spoke. She wasn't supposed to see the room. It was on a Sunday, the one morning the penthouse felt closest to ordinary, when the operational rhythm of Jinho's world slowed just enough for silence to exist without pressure. Zoe had been looking for a phone charger she'd left somewhere the previous night and had taken a wrong turn down a corridor she hadn't been down before. The door at the end was slightly open. She wasn't going to look. She was already turning back when something on the wall inside stopped her, not dramatically, not with any cinematic clarity, but with the quiet, insistent pull of something that demanded to be understood. It was a board, floor to ceiling, photographs and documents and connecting lines and names, the kind of obsessive architectural map of something that takes years to build. At the center of it, connected to everything else by lines that radiated outward like a web, was a single name, Yoon. She looked for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and stayed very still for a long time. That evening, Jinho came home to find dinner on the stove. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pot, and then at Zoe, who was sitting at the counter reading, and the confusion on his face, brief, unguarded, almost boyish in its surprise, was the most human she had ever seen him. "You cooked," he said. "The food in this penthouse is depressing," she replied, without looking up. He sat. She served. They ate in the kind of silence that had changed its quality somewhere along the way, without either of them formally acknowledging it. Midway through the meal, he said, unprompted and quietly, as if the words had made their own decision to come out, "I had a brother." Zoe set down her fork. She didn't speak. She understood instinctively that this was not a moment for questions. "He was 22, Jinho continued. His voice was level, the kind of level that costs something. He was in the wrong place, the wrong time, except it wasn't random. It was the result of a specific operation run by specific people who are still operating, still in the same rooms, still at the same tables." He looked at his food. "I decided a long time ago that I would build something they couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss, and couldn't touch, and I would use it to reach them." The silence afterwards was enormous and very quiet. Zoe picked up her fork again. She finished her meal. She did not offer comfort or soft words or the kind of careful tenderness that would have made him close back up immediately. She simply stayed, present and unafraid and completely real. It was, Jinho would think later, the most devastating thing anyone had ever done to him. He found her on a Wednesday afternoon in the lobby of a gallery where she'd been sent ahead of Jinho for a charity event, alone for 11 minutes while her security did a perimeter check, and Yoon had clearly known exactly how long 11 minutes was. He came in from the side entrance, unhurried, with two men positioned at just enough distance to mean something. "Mrs. Kang," he said. Same warm smile, same professorial ease. What a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. He stood close enough that stepping back would have looked like what it was. So Zoe didn't step back. She held her ground in her glass of water and looked at him with the kind of direct, unhurried calm that she had been using on dangerous men since she was 19 years old and working night shifts in neighborhoods that didn't show up on tourist maps. He spoke for 5 minutes. It was elegant, and it was a threat. He knew the marriage was a construction. He knew she was leverage. He knew things about Jinho's operation that he delivered as casual observations, each one placed precisely, the way you place something fragile on the edge of a table. And then, just before he left, he said, "Ask him where the money really comes from. He's been carrying a secret that belongs to both of you now. That makes it your problem, too." He left. Her security returned 40 seconds later. She stood exactly where she was and breathed. That night, she told Jinho everything. Every word, every placement, every second of it. Jinho listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. And the quiet was different from his usual kind. This one had edges. What happened next was swift and, from what fragments reached her, comprehensive. She didn't ask for details. She didn't want them. What she didn't expect was what came after. He came back to the penthouse past midnight, and instead of disappearing into his study as he always did, he came and sat beside her on the couch in the dark living room. No words, no explanation. He simply sat, close enough that his shoulder was an inch from hers, and stayed. Somewhere in the third hour, in the dark, in the silence, and the weight of everything she had been holding since that gallery lobby, Zoe cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, with the exhausted honesty of someone who had been holding something too heavy for too long. Jinho didn't move, didn't speak, didn't make it mean something out loud. He just stayed. And somehow, that was the most frightening thing he had ever done to her. She found it on a Thursday morning when Jinho was out and Mira was in a call downstairs. She wasn't looking for it. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward. She wasn't looking for anything. She was trying to find the building's maintenance schedule because the heating in her room had been inconsistent for a week and no one had fixed it. And she'd gone into the building management files on the shared server and taken a wrong turn in the directory. The folder was labeled with a case reference number. She almost closed it. Instead, she opened it. It took her 20 minutes to read through what was there. Financial records, incorporation documents, property registrations going back 11 years, shell companies that traced, if you followed them with patience and attention, back to completely legitimate sources: private investment capital, managed funds, legal real estate holdings. Not a single dirty cent at the foundation. The empire everyone feared was built on clean money. And underneath the financial architecture, in a subfolder she almost missed, a secondary file: operational records, targets, a 15-year timeline of systematic, deliberate destruction aimed at one network, piece by piece, associate by associate. All of it moving with the patience of someone who had decided they had all the time in the world toward a single name, at the center: Yoon. Zoe closed the laptop, sat back, looked at the ceiling. Then she went and found Jinho. He was in his study when she appeared in the doorway with the laptop. He looked at her face first, and she watched something shift in his, the way a landscape shifts when weather is coming. He looked at the laptop, back at her face. He didn't insult her by pretending. "Sit down," he said. She sat, and for the first time since she had known him, Kang Jinho, the man who controlled every room he entered, who had never once been caught with the right words in the right order, talked without performance. About his brother, about the years of watching Yoon operate with impunity, about the decision to build something powerful enough, legitimate enough, untouchable enough to actually reach him. Every piece of it was designed to be clean, he said, so that when the moment comes, when Yoon goes down, nothing I've built can be used to dismiss it. No one can call it criminal interference. The evidence has to hold. Zoe was quiet for a long time. And me? She finally said. Where do I fit in your file? He held her gaze. You were a calculated decision that stopped being calculated, he said. I don't know what to do with that. I've been trying to figure it out since approximately the second week. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't soft or romantic or easy. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. She left the room without responding. She needed to think. She needed air and distance and the particular quiet of her own thoughts without his presence filling them. But that night, when she passed his study, the door was open, and she stopped in the doorway for a moment without knowing why, and he looked up from his desk. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them walked away. The call came on a Friday morning. Zoe had gone out for her first solo walk in weeks. Jin-ho had quietly extended her supervised freedom as the weeks passed, and she'd claimed a small park 3 blocks away as hers. She was on a bench with coffee when 2 men she didn't recognize sat on either side of her with the practiced naturalness of people who had done this many times before. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Mr. Yoon would like Mr. Kang to know, the one on her left said pleasantly, that his wife will be available for collection in approximately 4 hours if he would like to make arrangements. And then they stood and walked away, and 2 more appeared from the tree line before she could move. She was taken without a scene. Yoon's message to Jin-ho was delivered within the hour. It was elegant in its simplicity. Surrender the evidence file, every document, every record, every piece of the 15-year case, and Zoe would be returned unharmed. Refuse, and Yoon would demonstrate publicly and permanently what happened to people who built empires aimed at him. Jin-ho's inner circle gathered within 20 minutes. Taewon, Mira, 3 senior lieutenants who had been with him since the beginning. They laid out the calculus with the professional clarity of people who understood what was at stake. 15 years, a complete evidentiary case, the only real shot at Yoon that ever existed or likely ever would, against one woman who had signed a contract and had been warned implicitly of the risks. The room waited. Jin-ho stood at the window with his back to all of them for a long time. Then he said, quietly and with complete finality, "Find where she is." Mira looked at Taewon. Taewon looked at the floor. The file, one of the lieutenants began, "Find where she is." Nobody argued, not because they agreed, but because the man standing at that window had just made a decision with his whole self, the kind of decision that doesn't negotiate and doesn't reverse. And every person in that room had known him long enough to recognize it. He found her in a secured location in the industrial district south of the river. He didn't send people ahead. He came himself, with Taewon and 2 others, and he moved through that building with the cold, absolute efficiency of a man who built an empire and knew exactly what it was for. Zoe was unharmed. She was sitting in a chair in a bare room, and when the door opened and it was him, just him first before the others, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the magnificent composure of a woman who refused to let anyone see her break, "You took your time." Something moved across his face, something that wasn't the crime boss or the mission or the performance. "He came myself," he said. She understood what that meant. Yoon was taken down on a Tuesday. Not by force, not by the kind of dramatic public reckoning that the scale of his crimes might have seemed to demand. He was taken down by paper, by 15 years of meticulous, legally unimpeachable documentation delivered through channels that could not be dismissed, discredited, or disappeared. bank records, communications, operational links between his political office and the network that had been running beneath Seoul's surface for 2 decades. The arrest was made at 7 in the morning outside his home, in front of his neighbors, in the quiet and devastating way that actual justice sometimes moves when it finally gets there. Jin-ho watched the news report from his study. He didn't celebrate. He sat in the silence of a man who had spent 15 years walking toward a single moment and had now arrived, and found that arriving felt less like victory and more like being set down after carrying something very heavy for a very long time. His brother's photograph was on the desk. It had always been on the desk. Zoe had noticed it weeks ago and said nothing, which he had understood as its own kind of care. The contract, technically, was fulfilled. The terms had been met. There was no legal or operational reason for Zoe to remain. He didn't ask her to stay. He told himself it was because he didn't have the right. He told himself it was because she had been placed in danger because of him, used without her full knowledge as a component of something she hadn't fully consented to, and the least he could do was let her leave cleanly. He told himself a lot of things that week. She left on a Thursday afternoon with her worn bag and her mother's photograph and the dignity of a woman who walked into rooms on her own terms and left the same way. Jin-ho stood at the window for a very long time after. On Saturday night, he sat in the kitchen where they had eaten dinner, where she had put food on the stove on a Sunday because she said the penthouse was depressing, where she had laughed at 2 in the morning and unsettled something in him that had never fully resettled. He sat there in the quiet and he thought about a woman who had stood in front of 6 men at 4 a.m. and looked back at her broom. He wasn't a man built for hoping. He had long ago traded that particular capacity for something more functional. But he sat in the kitchen until it was very late. At 4 a.m., the same hour it had all begun, the same dark and wet and quiet Seoul morning, he heard the elevator. He didn't move. The penthouse door opened, footsteps he recognized without needing to look, the particular weight and rhythm of someone who walked like they owned whatever ground they were standing on. Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing her own clothes. She had her bag on her shoulder. She looked at him sitting there in the dark, and she looked at the kitchen counter where her mother's photograph was not, where she had taken it when she left, and she reached into her bag and put it back in its place. Then she pulled out the stool across from him and sat down. "You have a lot to answer for," she said. "I made a list." Jin-ho looked at her across the counter, at the photograph, at the particular expression on her face that was serious and tired and completely unmistakably hers. "It's a long list," he said. "I know," she said. "Start talking." Outside, Seoul was dark and wet and moving through the last hour before dawn. The city that had never once thought about Zoe was completely unaware she was here, in this kitchen, in this penthouse, 47 floors above the streets she used to clean, choosing, with full knowledge and open eyes, to stay. Some things don't need grand words. Some things are spoken entirely in returning. Zoe came into this story as someone the world had decided not to see. A woman pushing a cart through empty streets at 4 a.m., sending money home, surviving, asking nothing from a city that offered nothing back. She left it as the only thing a ruthless, armored, singular man had ever chosen over everything else he had spent 15 years building. She didn't save him with softness. She didn't transform him with love in the way stories sometimes lazily promise. She simply refused, from the very first night, in a penthouse she didn't belong in, wearing clothes that were hers, to be invisible, to be managed, to be a component in anyone else's operation. And that refusal, quiet and absolute and completely her own, was the crack that let something real come through. Jin-ho built an empire to hunt monsters. He was so focused on what he was destroying that he had stopped thinking about what he was protecting. He had given his entire identity, his name, his reputation, his ability to be known to a mission born from grief. And he had done it so completely for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen by someone who wasn't afraid of what they found. Until Zoe. He thought a weakness would be the end of him. It turned out to be the first real thing he'd felt in 15 years. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell. You already know. Drop a comment below. What was the moment that got you? And tell us where in the world you're watching from. This community reaches every corner of the globe, and we are grateful for every single one of you. See you in the next story.